The last topic that we're going to get into for our discussion of cells is metabolism. So we talked about the importance of cells and living organisms being able to use energy, and that it's one of the characteristics of living things. They have to have their own machinery to do metabolism. Well, we're finally getting to talk about it now. So this lecture is going to cover just an overview of what is energy, what is the currency of energy in the cell, and then just a little bit about metabolism overall. So looking into these ATP and energy carrier molecules, these are some of our learning objectives, and these are our key terms. So let's dive in. So all of you are engineers, and you're going to have a much deeper dive into energy than what I can supply here. So this is just a very brief overview, enough to serve the purposes of our course. But energy is the ability to do work. That's its definition. So in a cell, work looks like moving the cell, spinning that flagella to get away from a predator or find food. It could be performing a chemical reaction that requires energy. It could be reproducing. It could be copying your DNA, fighting off infections, digesting food. Lots of different reactions and actions within a cell require energy. And no matter what, everything still must conform to the law of conservation of energy, where energy can't be created, it can't be destroyed, it only cycles between different forms. And that's exactly what we're going to be seeing when we talk about cellular respiration and photosynthesis. How does the cell capture energy in one form and modify it and convert it and cycle it between different forms to do the work of the cell? So some of the forms of energy out there, you have electrical. This is one we're going to be discussing a lot. That is just the energy from electrons flowing through the membrane in the case of the cell. We have chemical energy, which is due to the breakage and formation of bonds between elements and between other molecules. There's thermal energy, which is just heat. So this is with the vibration of the atoms. Are they vibrating quickly or are they vibrating less quickly? Then we're also going to discuss radiant energy in the form of light or photons. And then we will also have mechanical or kinetic energy, which is the energy of movement. Now, we don't really get into nuclear or gravitational in this course, but there's also, still more forms of energy out there. So we're going to be looking at this list here and kind of showing how the cell uses energy and converts it through all these different forms. Now, you've probably learned this in the past, but the cell's primary energy molecule is ATP. I've also mentioned in the course that this is the main chemical that we use for energy, but the cell really likes to use proton motive force as well as a way to do work. It provides energy to the cell where they use something like ATP to create a gradient where lots of hydrogen ions are on one side of the membrane, and then they allow those hydrogen ions to flow through a protein, and they capture the energy from that proton flow to power some other thing within the cell. So those are kind of the two main ways that cells tend to store up and use energy in the cell. But let's get back to ATP, the one we haven't gone deep dive into yet. So this is the chemical structure of the molecule here, and I want to just break it down simply. We're not going to need to know every single atom, but you have an adenine here, which is a nitrogen base, same as what you might have learned about DNA in previous courses. And you have a sugar right here, in this case a ribose sugar. And then you have 3 phosphate groups. So when we're talking about DNA and RNA, this is actually the starting point here, if we just include one phosphate group. So this is in the nucleic acid family of biomolecules. Remember, we had carbs, we had proteins, we had lipids, and nucleic acids. So this falls in the same family of molecules as DNA and RNA, which we're going to get to later in the course. But ATP has 3 phosphate groups, and this is where the magic is. If you remember when we talked about the phospholipid, the head of the phospholipid has a phosphate group, and it had a negative charge associated with it. So here we have 3 phosphate groups attached to each other, all with negative charges. So we're building up a lot of energy here in the sense that similar charges don't like to be forced next to each other. So we're forcing 3 highly negative molecules next to each other, and they do not want to stay that way. Excuse me. So overall, this is the structure of ATP. Adenosine, which is this combination here, triphosphate, tri meaning 3. Now, ATP's bonds act like a rechargeable battery. So they store energy in the bonds connecting those 3 phosphate groups. The bond between the second and the third phosphate group is the one that holds the most energy. So when we break that bond, we can release all the stored energy in that bond. That means when we form the bond, we have to store the energy. It takes energy to create that bond, but when we break it, we can release that energy. There is also energy here between the first and the second phosphate. There is also energy in the bond between the adenosine and the first phosphate group, but it's significantly less available energy than the second and third bonds. And that's secondary to the fact that we have all those negative charges forced together. So not only are we breaking a chemical bond, which automatically releases energy, but we have basically extra stored potential in the sense that we have 1, 2, 3 negative charges. It's almost saying like as soon as we break this bond, it's going to just throw that extra phosphate group away because it doesn't want all those negative charges accumulating next to each other. This is a very elementary way of explaining it, but I hope it helps you understand the idea of why there's so much energy stored up in that second and third bond, why this is a important molecule. So what we have is a fully charged up ATP here. We can break that bond, and what we get is energy released, and a phosphate group is also released. We now call it an inorganic phosphate, and it is just released into the cell. What we're left with is a molecule called ADP, adenosine diphosphate, and it only has 2 phosphate groups, and it's the uncharged form of the molecule. This is basically considered depleted of energy. The battery is empty. So what we have to do is do something like eat food and get energy from the food to take that energy to take that phosphate group and stick it back on the ATP. So forming the bond between the second and the third stores the energy. Breaking the bond is the thing that releases the energy. We have the charged up version, ATP, with the 3 phosphates, and the uncharged version, ADP, adenosine diphosphate, with only 2. Now, the way ATP works is very fascinating. Phosphate groups can be added onto molecules to make them unstable. So what ATP does is it provides energy through a process called reaction coupling. Let's say we want to take this glutamic acid, which is an amino acid, and add an amino group to it. And when we do that, we want to make glutamine. Well, the best way to do this, because this is a highly energy intensive process, is to take ATP and take its third phosphate group, break it off, and the energy released is used to take that third phosphate group and attach it to the glutamic acid. This intermediate is now phosphorylated, so it's very, very unstable. This brings down the activation energy to then convert this glutamic acid into glutamine. Basically, this is so unstable that it's going to want to get rid of that phosphate group and allow this reaction to occur. So now we've created the conditions where we're more likely able to get this reaction to occur because we made it unstable. So it's partially the actual release of the energy from ATP that powers it, and it's partially this reaction coupling where we make an unstable intermediate that lowers the activation energy of the next reaction that occurs. Now, in order for the cell to make ATP, it needs electrons. We get those electrons from our food. So what happens is we digest our food, we steal electrons from it, and then we need a way to take those electrons and carry them to the mitochondria. In the mitochondria, we use the electrons to create electrical energy as the electrons flow through the membrane, and we use that electrical energy to power an enzyme that creates ATP. So in order to get the electrons from where we digested our food to our mitochondria, we use 3 different electron carriers: NADH, FADH2, and NADPH. Now, all of these are found in plants, but only the top 2 are used by animals. So NADH carries 1 electron, FADH2 can carry 2, and NADPH can carry 1 electron. So these effectively consider them to be electron Ubers. They're going to receive the electron, they're going to carry it where it needs to go, and then offload it at a certain location. Now, when we talk about reactions occurring in the cell, they fall under 2 different categories. Are we breaking down a molecule or are we building up a molecule? And so when we talk about this, we're really talking about our metabolism as a whole. So it's the sum of all of the reactions in the cell, every single one happening at all times. And we break those reactions down into 2 categories: anabolic reactions and catabolic reactions. So you may be a little bit more familiar with anabolism or anabolic reactions. If you've ever heard of anabolic steroids, you tend to use them if you want to put on more muscle. So we're building muscle here. These are the reactions in the cell that are going to use up energy to do things to build. They're going to repair, they're going to synthesize or build up larger molecules. So things like copying our DNA before the cell divides, or building muscle, or building lipids, or anything like that. Photosynthesis is an anabolic reaction. Catabolism, this is all of the reactions in the cell that break down a larger molecule into a simpler one to release energy. The primary example here is digestion. Another example is what we're going to talk about in class, which is cellular respiration, how we make our ATP from our food energy. So all of our anabolic reactions, all of our catabolic reactions, add them all up, and we call it metabolism. Now, there's one thing about metabolism and these reactions that we're going to get into a little bit here, and it has to do with the second law of thermodynamics again. In the end, if we follow the second law of thermodynamics, every single reaction is going to end up at equilibrium. And when we look at chemical reactions, they're always reversible. A and B become C and D, but C and D can also become A and B. So because they are reversible and can occur in either direction, equilibrium in our cells is a real threat. As everything just tends towards equilibrium in general, it's like this example here with the water wheel. If we're talking about a closed system, as the water flows down into this other container, they're eventually going to hit a point where they stop. And we don't really want that to happen in our cells, because if our metabolic reactions stop, we die. So we kind of want to keep them going to stay alive. So how do we solve this problem? We have created a way to prevent this, partially by how we're designed, but also evolution has solved this problem by breaking down reactions into smaller pieces. So let's get into that. Our metabolism is not just point A to point B. If we need to go from A to Z, we don't have a reaction that says A to Z. We have A to B. Then we'll have a reaction where B becomes C. Then C becomes D. And we'll break that whole reaction down into smaller pieces. So it'll look more like a multi-step little dam structure here that we're talking about. But the other interesting thing is we are not a closed system. Organisms are constantly having input in the form of food and stimuli from the environment, and we constantly have output. We're constantly getting rid of waste from our body. So in the end, nothing accumulates down here at the end because we're constantly emptying the waste products or using them in other ways. And we don't end up with too little on the other side because we have a constant intake. So this whole process here of being an open system and breaking down larger reactions into smaller reactions, many different smaller reactions, is basically called a metabolic pathway. This effectively prevents equilibrium from ever occurring because as I'm going from point A to point B, I'm also immediately using point B to go to point C. So I'm removing B and creating a pressure where A is always going to be moving to B because B is always moving to C and C is always moving to D. So we never have anything get stopped up. Now, on top of this, as I said, we have that open system where we don't just have some starting material and when we run out, too bad, we eat to get more. Now, metabolic reactions are incredibly complex. Our pathways are so convoluted. This is a brief overview of a little bit of what we're going to look at in class, where we talk about how we make ATP through cellular respiration. And you can kind of like say, oh, it's this tiny piece in what is a significantly larger pathway within the cell if we were to really get more complex and more convoluted. Now, this is just it's not a real example here, but this is effectively how complicated some of these metabolic pathways can get. And that's because if we hit equilibrium, it is so devastating to our cells. So we need to have lots of checks in place, and so many intermediates get used in other reactions that they're all interconnected with each other. And so that is it for this week's homework. Let me know if you have any questions.